The music industry has gone through more changes than it probably would have liked in the last few decades, some of them good and some of them bad. However, one thing that certainly hasn't changed is the deep underbelly of the industry that exists to gather unreleased music to leak and profit from. There are groups of people and individuals who leak music from some of the biggest artists out there, and they don't all do it for the same reason. Diving into an underground world is always weird. It's sort of like the groups of people like Yi-Fi or RARBG that provide a wide array of pirated movies to people. People use Telegram, torrenting sites, Discord groups, forums, or even larger platforms like YouTube and Spotify to leak some of the most high-profile music out there. These leaks don't only include songs that may be leaked a few weeks early, but also music that might have sat in an artist or label's vault forever that was never meant to be seen. Subreddits like Rap Leaks or the site Leak This are largely run by young hackers or people using social engineering to get access to tracks. The IFPI released their 2022 music report that took data from over 44,000 music listeners, which showed that even in the modern day, somewhere around 30% of global music listeners still pirate music at least some of the time. Of course, not all the music pirated is in the form of leaks or unreleased songs, but it highlights how prevalent this underground industry still is. This stuff isn't even limited to music listeners either. Labels themselves have been known to leak music to generate hype and upload unreleased music on YouTube under dummy accounts to generate buzz about their artists. Hard drives are consistently stolen from offices and engineers that contain unreleased or unfinished music that gets leaked one way or another to the masses. The consumer's thirst for media created by their favorite artists has never wavered throughout the years, and it's only grown larger as music becomes more accessible. However, bootleg music, leaked songs, or unreleased work dates back much further than today's climate of hacked iCloud accounts or labels trying to squeeze extra mileage out of a song by selling it to leakers first to get some free press. Let's travel back in time to see where this underground industry started. Surprisingly, the origins of bootleg media spawned roughly around the era of Shakespeare. According to author Clinton Hayland, a music and artist biographer, bootleg copies of transcripts from Shakespeare's plays were being distributed before they were ever officially released. When it came to music, though, one of the first recorded instances of theft or piracy was when Mozart pirated a choral arrangement of a song from the Vatican. During the 1600s, to hear this piece of music, you'd have to travel to the Vatican physically, and the church was very opposed to replicating sheet music to give out to people. That changed, however, when Emperor Leopold convinced the Pope to make a copy for him. This got the ball rolling for the piece to leak, and traveling forward in time to the 1700s, a 14-year-old Mozart attended a mass in Rome. He heard the piece and transcribed the entire 15-minute performance by memory. His father, also named Leopold, boasted to his friends and family about his son's transcription of the piece, resulting in it spreading further. This tale is hundreds of years old at this point, and the only real account we have of it happening are through word of mouth from his father. Both the origin and accuracy of this account have been disputed. So for now, we can only point to this being one of the first bootleg copies of sheet music being produced as a mere possibility. However, the illicit industry of bootlegging or leaking music would not explode until much later in the 1960s. One of the first instances in the 20th century of bootleg copies of music bubbled up was with none other than Bob Dylan. With his abrupt disappearance from the public eye in 1966 after a motorcycle accident, some other artists had created songs with unreleased Bob Dylan tracks that were hits, resulting in a frenzy starting to get the original Bob Dylan recordings. Los Angeles radio stations aired some of these recordings, which caused some pirates to use their contacts in the radio industry to get their hands on a reel-to-reel tape copy of a number of the unreleased Bob Dylan tracks. They took it to a pressing plant to create over 2,000 copies of the tape, paying in cash for anonymity, and placed it in a blank white cover with the Great White Wonder stamped on the front. After this happened, Bob Dylan's work became some of the most pirated in history, with a number of different unreleased and leaked albums coming from bootleggers. Another type of early pirating didn't necessarily have to do with leaked music, but rather people would record live shows and release them on tape or sell them to others. In 1969, this happened with the Rolling Stones as they announced their American tour when a well-known bootlegger named Dub decided to record all of their shows. This recording went on to sell tens of thousands of copies and was even praised by the Rolling Stones for its quality. It even sparked the creation of the official live album Get Your Ya-Ya's Out. Music piracy in the 60s was booming, and the label RCA had estimated that there were over 2 million illicit copies of the Sound of Music movie soundtrack from the 1965 film. However, by the 70s, the piracy industry within music was escalating rapidly, with entire labels dedicated to profiting off bootleg music like Cornyphone or TMQ. These labels were sending people to record live shows and even radio broadcasts from the fast-growing rock scene, with bands like Led Zeppelin and Bruce Springsteen being major targets for unofficial leaks. A lot of these releases weren't only of songs to be released later, but works sourced from anonymous people with contacts in the industry who wanted to profit off of songs from bands who were defunct or artists that had many songs that were never meant to be released. One of the reasons these tapes were being produced en masse was because printing companies who weren't as large as the huge corporations gleefully accepted bootleggers' tapes that were of questionable legality to make some extra money. During this time, piracy had reached a critical mass, and most of it was entirely through word of mouth, although some more well-known bootleggers like Rubber Dubber would send their unofficial copies to publications like Rolling Stone to be reviewed. So we've covered how these bootleggers get and release their copies of songs or albums, but how did consumers get them into their hands? Well, we are far and away from the internet era, but even back then, through word of mouth, things could still spread like wildfire. A popular method for sourcing unreleased music was through somewhat shady magazines like Hot Wax, which was a publication that exclusively printed information about upcoming releases and where to get them from. The book originated in Canada and has been floating around for about 25 years. It also included reviews, quality checks, and album art for music leaks. Sadly, I couldn't find much information about whether or not the physical copies of this book are still being printed. However, they do still regularly update their website with the same type of information about leaks and upcoming releases. Their site even looks like something straight out of the GeoCities era, with reprinted graphics for the background and plain text and bright blue hyperlinks. Another phenomenon that was observed and studied during this time was the concept of a fanzine or fandom magazine, which reinforced the behavior of mass piracy. The British invasion of American music like the Beatles further stoked the flames as artists and bands were getting global attention, resulting in more people looking for and reproducing bootleg copies of popular songs. The author L.R.E. King, who wrote a book detailing the unreleased music industry, was quoted as saying, "Trying to understand the Beatles' music only through their authorized releases is like trying to understand a car by admiring its paint job." It was clear by now that average listeners, music collectors, journalists, and the world at large were engrossed in the world of unreleased music, and these illicit copies of that music were desired so deeply that people set aside their principles to come together to find these works. Even legitimate music journalists and publications were now reviewing bootleg copies of music because they were so popular. This would soon change though, as the revised copyright statute in America, signed into law in 1976, was strongly enforced when it came to large magazines and other big publications. The companies who were profiting off of reviewing and distributing the bootlegs were scared off by lawsuits from major record companies. At this point, the scene had mostly been underground, and while copyright revisions managed to scare off the more legitimate players, this would not stop the industry as a whole from evolving and pushing the limits going into the 1980s. Up until this point, the majority of leaks were stored on vinyl or reel-to-reel tapes, which were fairly expensive along with the equipment to manufacture your own, but this changed when the popularity of cassettes exploded. It was now possible for individuals to not only record their own bootlegs more easily, but distribute them for far cheaper. On top of that, cassettes and videotapes were far smaller, and all of this combined made for a meteoric rise in piracy and music leaks. This got the attention of the music industry, and specifically RIA among some high-profile bands, as they saw this as a major threat to their business. If you don't know, our good friends Ria would totally never sue individuals for hundreds of thousands of dollars for bootlegging music or trying to bankrupt people who use Napster. Needless to say, these guys fought tooth and nail against copyright infringement and were upsetty spaghetti about how quickly the piracy scene was growing. This only ignited the fire further as pirates banded together and got more sneaky with their methods. The tape trading scene popped up around this time, and this is where the honor system spawned when it came to passing it forward to other pirates. People who received copies of music would promise to create more copies and pass them around to more people, which would later translate into the internet era, with pirates promising to seed torrents online so that others could enjoy the things they downloaded. This huge surge in piracy resulted in an estimated $500 million loss to the industry during this time period. This figure, and whether or not piracy truly lost the industry money, is a hotly debated topic, and I am most certainly not equipped to go down that rabbit hole right now, but needless to say, leaks, piracy, and unreleased music was being passed around like candy during this time. The underground scene was growing, and people started passing out copies of leaks at music festivals or had booths at different conventions to trade or sell tapes. However, this was quickly stamped out by festival officials who raided these stalls and booths with pressure from RIA and other organizations. The 80s were some of the last years where leaks and bootlegs were passed around via cassettes because the compact disc would get introduced and slowly become more popular going into the 90s. With the advent of CDs, music collectors would dub this era the golden age for Beatles leaks because not only the number of them increased, but the quality did as well. At the tail end of the 80s, there were a few high-profile leaks that happened with major artists, one being with Prince's The Black Album. It was supposed to be released near the end of 1987, but was abruptly cancelled and over 500,000 copies of the album were to be destroyed. Unfortunately for the label, some advanced copies made it out to the wild, and bootleg versions of the album were created and spread so much that the official album ended up being released anyway. Even larger than that, though, would be the unveiling of the Ultra Rare tracks, which was a compilation of studio outtakes and previously unheard bootleg music from the Beatles. It came out in 1988, and the leakers used a loophole in ambiguously written copyright laws pertaining to older music to release it safely. There were 8 volumes of the Ultra Rare tracks, and they were considered to be the first true high-quality leak from the Beatles because they were remastered to be on CDs. This specific leak highlights one of the very obvious but effective ways to source leaked music. The story goes like this. An engineer working at Abbey Road Studios made backup copies of recorded music on tapes that were not to be replicated. However, because of some people's morally ambiguous nature and willingness to look the other way for a payout, some of the tapes got into the hands of a Dutch collector in exchange for $20,000. These tapes were then resold to a German fan of the Beatles named Dieter Schubert, who used the previously mentioned laws to create his own label and release the works as CDs. He believed that any recordings that were made before the 1966 Rome Convention ratified in Germany belonged in the public domain. Unfortunately for EMI, which was the label the Beatles previously belonged to, the tracks on the CDs were spread far and wide and are considered to be some of the most important music leaks in history. Not only was it a big deal for Beatles fans, but it also convinced fans of music in general that labels and studios were stowing away far more unreleased music from a variety of artists that could be found and then released to the public. It's not too hard to believe that labels and studios would hold unreleased music in their vaults that never saw the light of day for a variety of reasons. Artists work on things all the time that don't end up working out or never actually appear on a released project. This would become a common theme within the world of piracy and leaks, where hard drives, laptops, tapes, or CDs that were tucked away in a label's archive would suddenly exchange hands and then be replicated and released to the public. Things were pretty crazy during these past few decades, but these events were comparably small when viewed with a more modern lens. To me, the 90s and onward are when piracy mixed with the internet caused a hurricane of leaks and unreleased music to no longer fly under the radar of average music listeners. Instead, it became almost a normal thing to do amongst friends, discussing your favorite leaks or unreleased songs of artists that you all listen to. During the 1990s, the quality of leaks and pirated copies of music got way better, not only because people started using high-fidelity digital files, but also the technology for producing and recording music was advancing at the same time. These were the last true years of physical bootlegging, which would move to countries with more lax laws as the West clamped down extremely hard on this type of music leaking. This would lead to the transition from tape trading and CD burning to torrenting and P2P file sharing, amongst other forms of distribution like forum posts, media fire links, group Google Drives, and eventually more modern platforms like YouTube and Spotify. This is where we arrive at one of the largest advancements in this underground industry ever, and that is the release of Napster in 1999. Napster was a P2P file sharing service emphasizing the distribution of digital audio files, and it got the ball rolling for what was to come in the future. Before 1999, there were other ways people shared leaks and unreleased music, like invite-only IRC chats or Usenet, which was much like a precursor to internet forums. However, none of these online methods rose to the heights that Napster and its successors eventually would. The internet not only made it easier to exchange illicit copies of music, but it also made it possible to convert older analog copies from CDs and tapes to a digital format and spread like wildfire. Napster would soon be followed by dozens of services after its shutdown like LimeWire and Kazaa, but these were simply distribution platforms that allowed the leaks to spread faster. So how were people sourcing these leaks during this time period? Well, there were of course still people swiping hardware from studios or paying an insider for access to physical copies, but the internet era allowed for many new avenues to gain access to unreleased copies of music. One of these new options was to hack into press releases for albums that were anticipated for release because reviewers and publications were given early access to the digital files. Some of the biggest leaks in history happened during this time period, such as the Metallica track I Disappear, which was set to be the soundtrack for the movie Mission Impossible 2. It got so bad, in fact, that this song found its way onto radio stations before the movie even released, resulting in the now famous Metallica v. Napster case. The court case resulted in Napster being forced to place a filter on their service, automatically searching for and removing any Metallica content, although it didn't end up in Napster being shut down just yet. Something else happened during this time period that links back perfectly to the beginning of this video, and that is that not all leaks are necessarily malicious. In fact, sometimes labels partake in the industry themselves to create hype or market their artist, and they did exactly this with Radiohead's 2000 album Kid A. Since Radiohead did not want to do any self-promotion or be a part of the usual album news cycle, Capitol Records decided to give the pre-release album to hundreds of different websites for fans to connect the dots. The album debuted at number 1 on the Billboard charts and proved that this was a viable promotion strategy for labels, and this would happen many times in the future. During 2008, we saw an 11% drop in album sales industry-wide, and many labels and other parties attributed this to piracy and album leaks. However, with albums like The Carter 3 by Lil Wayne in 2008 that got leaked, it's hard to say whether or not leaks impacted album sales, as he outsold many other large artists at the time like Usher. Now, here is where I would argue that the leaking industry changed from generally being about simply releasing music that the world has previously never heard, to being about racing to be the first to the product so you could profit off of it, including people from within the music industry. After YouTube and Spotify were launched is when things got pretty crazy. This would be the era of hacked iClouds and data breaches, leading to some of the most unprecedented music leaks. The interesting thing here is that the way hackers got a hold of details wasn't related to the music industry at all. Rather, people would sift through huge data dumps from hacks like Equifax, Yahoo, or Facebook to find the details of managers, A&R reps, executives, or even artists themselves to then use those details to gain access to emails or Dropbox accounts. Once all the songs are harvested, there are many different avenues they can go down to spread them, which we've spoken about briefly before. But to give a full picture, let's investigate each one by one. I think the more underground and less talked about areas where music spreads in the modern day is in Discord servers and forums where people share directly through the chat or use Google Drive and Mediafire links to host pirated or leaked music. There are plenty of smaller Discord servers dedicated to producing leaks of a specific artist like Lil Peep or Juice WRLD amongst others, but there are also larger communities that post all things music. Discord does try to combat this, but there's always going to be more servers popping up to replace the ones that have been terminated. Next up is Reddit. Now, Reddit has been pretty diligent at banning communities created exclusively to source and download files to avoid copyright infringement. One of the subreddits that was taken down for doing this was r/rapleaks, which is a giant hub with thousands of members who congregated to talk about and find unreleased music of artists that they enjoy. However, even though many communities on Reddit have been banned for sharing the links to pirated media, there are still active subreddits out there that are for discussing piracy, leaks, and unreleased music. One of the larger ones that is not exclusive to music is r/piracy, which has over 1 million members. The two biggest places that contain an absolute goldmine of leaks and unreleased songs are none other than YouTube and Spotify. One artist in particular comes to mind here, and that is the late Juice WRLD. It's been confirmed by his label that Juice WRLD was one of the most prolific artists to ever grace the world of music, and it's estimated that he has over 3,000 unreleased songs that are either works in progress or fully finished. This massive unreleased catalog has been one of the most sought after in all of music, and hundreds of these songs have made it onto YouTube and Spotify. If you search Juice WRLD Unreleased on YouTube, you will literally get thousands of results ranging from individual tracks to multi-hour-long compilations of his unreleased music, much of which is monetized. But this isn't only limited to Juice. Hundreds of other artists' songs and albums that are not officially released have found their way onto YouTube, including older artists like Bob Dylan and the Beatles. The ethics of this are most definitely in a gray area, but that hasn't ever really stopped people before. Groups of people and individuals, like stated at the beginning of this video, can make tens of thousands of dollars per leak depending on the rarity and the artist of the songs, selling them to the highest bidder. These groups of hackers and music leakers often post huge playlists of unreleased music from a variety of artists on Spotify, and while Spotify tries to take them down, there are simply too many to keep track of. Something tangential to music leaks that I think deserves some attention is a more recent phenomenon. Producers on YouTube have been using leaked acapellas and creating instrumentals for them to go on top of, releasing them as remixes or their own interpretation of an artist's song. Popular creators who are known to do this are users like Red Limits, Beats by Ads, and Miro, who all create their own version of an artist's vision. To me personally, this is less in a gray area, and I do think their hearts are in the right place as they want to honor the memory of a late artist or get their creative itch scratched by interpolating what they think an artist could sound like. To wrap up this last section, I'd like to go over an article released by Vice where they interviewed a teenager who is a prominent figure in the music leaking scene. In the interview, he revealed much of the things we've talked about previously, like sourcing methods, how music gets leaked, where it gets posted, and what the stakes are when it comes to exchanging and selling unofficial music. Another thing he mentioned is that the majority of songs are purchased as a group because leaked songs and albums can run you thousands of dollars. Individuals will pool their resources together to purchase them and then release or resell them. To put this in context, just this one kid has leaked over 1,000 songs from high-profile artists like Lil Uzi Vert, Juice WRLD, and Young Thug, just to name a few. You can imagine if one kid can do this, then groups of people who dedicate hundreds and thousands of hours doing this can rapidly blow up the scale of this industry. Needless to say, the underground community behind all the leaks and piracy have a huge influence on the above-board music industry and are in constant flux with the artists and labels because of it. So where does this leave us? Is all of it ethical? What, if anything, should be done about it? Well, I don't really know. What I do know is that the underground industry is not going anywhere anytime soon because of the massive demand and profit to be made by participating. Thank you guys for watching, stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video.